Percival.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. So I'm sure quite a few of you here tonight are feeling a little bit anxious, confused about AI, not sure what the implications are. Maybe you've come along tonight to maybe get a bit of reassurance and understanding about the technology. The bad news is, I'm afraid you're going to probably leave confused and anxious about AI, but you'll be confused and anxious about a whole load of things that you didn't know you should be confused and anxious about. The simple fact is, we are all on this AI roller coaster, whether we like it or whether we don't. And we don't know where we're going, particularly. None of us chose to get on it, and we certainly don't have any kind of emergency stop button to help us. Now, depending on who you listen to, this AI revolution is either going to usher in a whole new era of prosperity, it's going to cure cancer, solve global warming, give us all this wonderful new life, or it's going to collapse civilization, take all our jobs away, and turn us all into household pets. Sometimes you hear the same people making the same prediction just on different days of the week. And you might have heard something about something called artificial general intelligence, which is this whole new technology which we're promised, sometimes called AGI, and no one's really sure what it means, but some people think it might mean a conscious artificial intelligence. And added to that, we're told that AI is going to suck all the power out of a grid. There's predictions that say within 2 decades, 30% of our power will be going to power AI data centers. Scary thought. And even the Pope's got in on the act. You probably saw a couple of weeks ago, the Pope issued this big, long warning about the dangers of AI. And when the Vatican starts getting interested in their technology, you kind of know it's probably hit the mainstream. But there's one question that does keep coming up again and again, and that question is, are we in danger, deliberately or accidentally, of creating a conscious AI entity? And it's a serious question, because if we are, what does it mean, both for us and for it? Does it create ethical obligations on us? Does it mean we're going to have to start giving it rights? Do we have the right to switch off a conscious AI, for example? Could it suffer? And some people think this might be an extremely premature time to ask this question, but I think we need to give it serious thought, because let's be honest, we haven't got a great track record in our ethical treatment of other sentient beings. And it's fair enough to ask, do we want to make the same mistake all over again? And even the CEO of Anthropic recently said, this is the creator of one of the most famous and most widely used chatbots called Claude, he said, and I quote, "We don't know if the models are conscious, but we're open to the idea that they could be." And some of us, probably if you're using chatbots, how many people use chatbots here? Show of hands. How many of you say please and thank you? Exactly. Now, are we saying please and thank you out of habit, or are we just hedging our bets in case when the machines come for us, we hope to keep on their good side? So the question we're going to answer here tonight, or we're going to ask, I should say, is can consciousness be computed? Now, this is quite a little bit of a different talk from some of the things we do at Philo Cafe. It's a bit more empirical. We're going to cover quite a lot of ground in a short space of time. So I would say hang on to your hats. And if some of the details don't sink in, don't worry too much about it. Enjoy the ride. I will be summarizing some of the key points as we go. But let's get into it. And of course, I have to find my mouse pointer. So you can't really address the question of can an AI be conscious unless we actually understand what even is consciousness. And that's a hard problem, let's be honest. It's something that's been asked repeatedly through history for the last 300 or 400 years. Interestingly enough, it's actually a relatively recent idea. It's only in the 17th century and around the time of Descartes that consciousness was actually recognized or started being addressed as a subject in its own right. There are a number of definitions of it. I find these definitions not great because they fall into 2 categories. Some are either self-referential. In other words, they kind of tend to define consciousness in synonyms, in terms which mean much the same thing, like experience and inner awareness and so on. Or they reference a theory that's trying to explain them. So they tend to say something like, if you have X, Y, and Z, then you have consciousness. both, I think, are not very satisfactory, not very intuitive, and sometimes I think what we're grasping for is perhaps a slightly more intuitive explanation that we can all kind of understand. The second question is, do we actually understand what we need to create consciousness? Do we need a biological system? Could we create consciousness out of a silicon network, for example? If we can, how big? How complicated does it need to be? Does it need to be hardware, or can we create it in that biological material that we're all made of, that techies call wetware? And so, to make us think about this question a little bit more, I'm just going to do a little thought experiment using my good friend Peter Boothby, who's sitting at the back of the room there. Peter, now let me ask you a simple question. What did you have for breakfast this morning? Avo toast and coffee. So let's imagine that after I've asked Peter that question, but before he answered it, we take Peter and we're going to put him in some amazing high-powered, yet-to-be-invented MRI machine. And this machine is going to take a perfect map of every aspect of Peter's brain. It's going to map every synapse and every neuron in Peter's brain. And then what we're going to do is we're going to build a model of Peter's brain. I hope we get a few volunteers here, because we're going to build that model out of ping pong balls and bits of string. We're going to build it in some big unused space. I had an idea of maybe Donald Trump's new ballroom might be a good venue. And then when we've built this model with every synapse and every neuron represented, we're going to operate it. We're going to get a team of volunteers and we're going to operate Peter's brain manually. So every time a synapse in Peter's brain, a neuron fires, we're going to follow that to the next one. We're going to write it down on the ping pong ball and we're going to carry this all the way through. And we're going to see whether we get the answer, avo, toast, and coffee. And then when we've done that, we're going to do this again. But the second time we're going to do it, we're going to do it with silicon. We'll borrow a data center from Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or somebody that can spare one or two, and we'll build Peter's brain in silicon. And we'll do the same thing. We'll fire it up, we'll run it, and we'll see, do we get the answer, avo, toast, and coffee? And then finally, we'll assume we've got a slightly bigger budget now, we're going to build a biological version of Peter's brain. Maybe we'll 3D print it. Maybe we'll grow it with neurons and test tubes and Petri dishes. But at the end of it, we will have, hopefully, a pretty perfect biological version of Peter's brain made out of neurons. We'll give it a blood supply. Sorry, Peter, we can't build you a whole new body. We haven't got the money for that. But you will have a spare brain that might be useful at some point in the future. Yeah, exactly. And again, we'll fire this up and we'll see, does it answer the question, avo, toast, and coffee? So I want you to think about this. Which one of these do you think is conscious? Which one's going to answer the question, and which one of them is conscious, if any or all of them? So we'll give Peter the benefit of the doubt. We'll assume our original Peter is conscious. Is his biological brain conscious? Or was there something missing when we transferred it from Peter into the biological copy? And if the biological copy is conscious, would the silicon copy also be conscious? Why, if it isn't, why not? What was there in the biological copy that we couldn't replicate in the silicon copy? And if you think the silicon copy is conscious, why not the ping pong balls and string version? Again, sounds a bit ridiculous, but we've created a copy of Peter's brain, and there are some theories of consciousness that say that would be conscious. And if it isn't conscious, maybe the consciousness doesn't exist in the ping pong balls and string, it exists in the brains of the people operating it in like microseconds as we operate it. It's a good question, and I'm sure everyone will have their own thoughts on this. And of course, philosophers love armchair questions, or rather they love thought experiments, because of course they can answer them in their own armchair. But the problem is, if you don't understand all the starting conditions for your thought experiment, the results you get, of course, are going to be very vague, as we're seeing with Peter's brain. And so really, we do need to understand a little bit more about what consciousness is or might be. But the problem we've got here is that when we start addressing that, we step into a minefield. There are some 300 plus theories of consciousness out there. And they spring from religion, spiritualism, neurobiology, psychology, mathematics, quantum mechanics, you name it. Somebody's developed a theory of consciousness. So for this to start with, I'm going to take the coward's way out. I'm not going to address what is consciousness. I'm going to ask her an easier question. Answer an easier question is, what is AI? And this is where we do get a little bit techie. I've got a nice big blue mouse pointer. So, if it was possible to lift the lid on one of these chatbots like ChatGPT or Claude, what you would see is not words, sentences, paragraph. You would see a vast, vast sea of numbers, up to 1 trillion numbers. Which represent what exactly? Well, the fundamental concept behind all artificial intelligence which you see today is a technology called the artificial neural network, or neural net. This underpins literally all AI. The roots go back to about the middle of the last century, but it's only really in the last 35 years or so that this technology has come to the fore, helped by more powerful, cheaper silicon chips and some quite smart developments along the way. Now, artificial neural networks are inspired by biology, but they are both very different from biology in both big ways and small ways. On the screen here, I've created a very simple neural net just so we can kind of understand some of the core concepts. And think of it a bit like a brain that's designed by somebody with OCD. So rather than have all those messy neurons going left, right, and center, a neural net has all its nodes on neurons developed in beautiful, neat layers. And every neuron is connected to every one in the previous layer and to every one in the layer after. So how does this work? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to train our network. We're going to train it to recognize the difference between dogs, cats, and rabbits. Now, that's easy for us, but for a neural net, that's actually quite hard. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to show it lots and lots of pictures. And again, I need to find my mouse pointer. There we go. Now, you might have heard that when artificial intelligence is trained, it takes vast amounts of power and vast amounts of money to do it. And the reason for that is that you need to train AI on huge, huge quantities of data. And for the large language model, this is mostly scraped, as they call it, pulled off the internet and then fed into the networks. So in our simple network here, we've just got a few pictures. In reality, we'd need to show it thousands, millions of pictures of dogs, cats, and rabbits before it's going to be able to tell the difference. But we can just imagine the concept here. So if I show it a cat, and I'll just start this here. Now, what I want you to watch is this number here. So what we're looking at here is as the network looks at all these images, as it starts to become trained, as we call it, it's looking at each of the images, each of the bits of data that we're feeding it, and it's looking to see whether it can recognize it. Now, when it starts off, of course, it has no idea what a dog, cat, or rabbit is. So I'll just pause it for a second. Every time we feed it more data, what the system does, what the neural network does, is it looks at the result that it got. So did we identify it correctly as a cat? No. In fact, we thought it was a dog to start with. So the system then takes the difference between what it thought it was going to get and what it did get, and it pushes that back into the network. So all these neurons, all these nodes are connected by numbers. And so we change those numbers. Every time we train it, we change the numbers. And when we do that thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of times, eventually the system starts to get it right. So I'll just run this through. And you'll watch that error number come down. Every time we show it more data, that number comes down. We really want to get that number down to 0. And in this case, it comes down to 0.18, or I think it comes down to 0.06. There we go. So we finished training up. We've shown it 5 million pictures of dogs, cats, and rabbits. And now we think it can now identify the difference between dogs, cats, and rabbits. So now we can put it to the test. Now, the key thing here, and this is true of all artificial intelligence, is once the network, once the system has been trained, it's frozen. We stop changing it. So when you're using ChatGPT or Claude, it's not learning anymore. It's got all that information embedded into the network, and it's frozen solid. It can't learn anymore. So in use, now we're going to show it a cat. Now it's going to recognize the cat's got a long tail and a round face. So it runs through the network, and bang, it guesses it correctly. It's a cat. I'll show it a dog. Boom, boom. Yay, it's got a dog. Now, what do you think happens when I show it a cow? We didn't train it on cows, did we? It doesn't know anything about cows. So what does it do? Well, it recognizes a cow has got a long tail and a large body. So the network reckons it must be a dog. And this is a pretty fundamental point about neural networks and artificial intelligence, is they don't know how to say, I don't know. They can't say, I haven't got a bloody clue. They will always give you an answer based on the probability of the data you've given them. And so you may have heard of what's called hallucinations in AI, where the system basically, I like to call it making shit up. You get, and you see these wonderful cases of lawyers that have cited all this case law in court, and the judge goes, what is this? And it's literally just hallucinations come out of the chatbot that they use to generate all their court materials. And this is the fundamental reason behind it, is because neural nets and AI can't say, I don't know. So they will always give you an answer, and that answer might be absolute nonsense, like thinking a cow is a dog.
Why couldn't they say, I don't know?
Because ultimately, they've only got a limited number of outputs, and this is a probability system. So it's looking at the probability of, given the input data, what is the probability of this being a dog, cat, or rabbit?
Couldn't they say need more training?
No, it's the architecture of the system. It's a fundamental limitation of the architecture of the system, is you can't do that. It's one of the kind of the things to be very aware of with AI. It'll give you the wrong answer with 100% confidence. Still wrong. So apologies if this slide's a little bit hard to read at the back. But I just wanted to kind of just summarize some of the key differences between what is a biological network and an artificial network. And let's just look at the top couple, because they're the most important ones. So as I said earlier, one of the key differences is that when you train an AI system, once the training's finished, bang, it's frozen, no further training takes place. Now, of course, with any kind of biological system, human or animal or whatever, all the way down from paramecium, learning is continuous. We never stop learning. There may be times in our life where we focus on learning, but all of us never stop learning from second to second, minute to minute. There may be some exceptions there. I'm thinking of a few politicians, perhaps, who learning, maybe not one of their strong points, but... And the other, I guess, key thing I'll say here is, remember our network, it runs from left to right. It's what we call, techie terms, a feed-forward network. It only goes one way. That's very different from any brain or biological system where you've got connections, networks and things which are going back on themselves, feeding back, recurrent networks and so on. So it is a very simplified system, but it is also a very, very effective system in its own right. And I'll just look briefly as well, for those who use chatbots, what is the technology behind the networks that power things like Claude and Gemini and ChatGPT? Now, these are called transformer networks, but at their basis, at their core, they are exactly the same. At the core, they've got that same neural network that we used a minute ago to train our dog, cat, and rabbit identification system. They do a few different things, and this is, I think, quite interesting if you've ever used a chatbot and wondered how it's working. When you type in text into that little window in ChatGPT, that text obviously goes to the server, and it gets broken up, not into words, but into tiny little pieces, tiny little syllables. And our kind of analogy here is almost like a sheet music, which is broken up into individual notes. And that all those little tokens, as they're called, they then go through a mathematical process that then relates them one to another. So if I put in the sentence, or the chatbot receives the sentence, the cat sat on the mat. Now, if you think about the first the, obviously relates to cat. The second the relates to mat. So you have to tell the network that first the is related to cat, second the related to mat. The system has to also understand the relationship between cat, mat, and sat. And so it builds this quite complicated mathematical model of all these tokens and words that you put into it, and then it chucks a whole lot into the network. And then what the network puts out is not an answer, it's one token. Literally one token. So the example we always use is, if I type in, what is the capital of France? What the system will put out is the word the. And then the word, they will put out the word, probably even just half the word, it will say capit or cap. And then it will say it'll. And then it will say of. And then it will say for, ans, is, par, is. Literally, it runs through the entire network every single time. So if you've ever watched that, if you've ever been using a chatbot and you watch that almost teletype type effect where almost one word is coming out at a time, quite slowly, that's because every token has to be pushed through the network. It's a slow, cumbersome, and incredibly inefficient process. And here's the thing, the more text you put into it, the amount of processing power it takes to actually process that is squared. So if I put in 10 words, it will take, say, 100 processing units to give me an answer. If I put in 20 words, it gives me 400. And if you've ever had a long conversation with a chatbot, which might run for several pages, that is literally an almost astronomical amount of processing power required to actually to process all that text. And this is why these things are using so much power. This is why they're building so many data centers and why they're destined or predicted to take 30% of all our electricity, because it is a very, very inefficient process. Anyhow, that's probably enough on, I guess, the technology. So I want to kind of like come back to the original question, which of course is, can consciousness be computed? And so let's look at some of the kind of discussion points and arguments about this. Now, I want to start with perhaps one of the most famous and well-known arguments by philosopher John Searle. And this was his key argument against computational consciousness. Now, this was a thought experiment he created, I think, back sometime in the 80s. And he imagined himself locked in a room, and he's been given the task of translating text into Chinese. And he speaks no Chinese. He understands no Chinese. And so he has been given a lookup table where when text comes in, he can look up the equivalent Chinese character and he can output that out of a little slot into the window. And he obviously keeps repeating this. Now, somebody outside this room might imagine there's something quite smart going on here, somebody who can understand Chinese. Reality is, it's just a simple computational process, a lookup table. And Searle's point was that if we kind of think of this representing some aspect of computation, whether it's a neuron or transistors or whatever, there is no understanding there. It's just purely a simple computational process. And his point was, it doesn't matter if you've got one Chinese room or 140 billion Chinese rooms, the result is the same. There's no understanding, there's no awareness, no consciousness. Now, he defended this argument for many years, and he actually had his own, funnily enough, he wasn't a dualist, he wasn't suggesting there was some kind of metaphysical explanation of consciousness. He just said that a lot of them, what are called materialist explanations of consciousness, didn't cut it. He also didn't say that AI couldn't be conscious. He just said that none of the technology that he was seeing at that point in time could possibly develop consciousness. And there are objections to Searle's argument, which we might come back to in a little bit, but it is still, I think, a very valid point, and one which has certainly stood the test of time. The second set of arguments come from the physicist called Roger Penrose. Now, Roger Penrose is an extraordinary guy. He's still, I think he's 95 now. You can still find lots of interviews with him on YouTube. He's quite an extraordinary polymath. And he was actually a colleague and collaborator of Stephen Hawking for many years. He worked on black holes and things. And back in the early 90s, he turned his attention to consciousness. And he came at this from a very mathematical perspective, probably not surprising given his background. He actually wrote two quite thick books on the subject. I've got one of them down here if anyone is interested in borrowing it. And his kind of logic was based around the idea of the fact that these mathematical paradoxes, which we'll look at in a second, could be understood by humans, but they cannot be understood by a computational process. And the two that he kind of focused on, one comes from a German mathematician called Kurt Gödel, who developed it in the 1930s. It's called Gödel's incompleteness theorem. We're not going to go too much into the techie details of it right now, but I wanted to try and create a visual analogy of it. And so what Gödel said is he said that of any system of mathematics or any system of mathematical proofs, there are mathematical statements within those which are true but cannot be proven within the system. That sounds probably a little bit kind of abstract and bizarre. So if we imagine here, I've created this kind of land of Mathematica, and we can imagine that you can walk from any point in Mathematica by following mathematical proofs to any other point on the land of Mathematica. But you'll see there's another land over there called Gödelia. And so Gödelia is those mathematical proofs that cannot be arrived at, or mathematical statements that cannot be arrived at, proved from within the land of Mathematica. So our poor robot here, who can only follow standard computation, is destined forever to wander the land of Mathematica. And Penrose's argument was a human who can understand these paradoxes, can helicopter above them and see both and arrive at both Gödelia and Mathematica. Hopefully that makes some kind of abstract sense to you. And the second one he looked at, which comes from the mathematician Alan Turing, who of course was famous for his code-breaking work in the Second World War. And Turing created another mathematical paradox called the halting problem. And he used kind of a very simple, kind of simplified computer called a Turing machine to prove that there are problems that cannot be solved by computers. It basically boils down to that. You can give a computer a problem which is unsolvable. It doesn't matter how much processing power you give it. It doesn't matter how many CPUs or data centers. The problem is fundamentally unsolvable. And the same, Penrose made the same point, is that humans can understand these paradoxes. Computers absolutely cannot, as Turing proved. Now again, Penrose, like Searle, there's a number of criticisms around his logic. Most of them, a lot of them come from the philosopher Daniel Dennett, who basically thought that Penrose had kind of lost the plot. In that he basically, I think effectively was saying, stay in your lane of black holes and physics, because he basically said that Penrose had made a fairly fundamental error in his basing all his logic on this concept of understanding, which Denning said. Penrose is basically saying that the understanding was a solid fact on which you could build this tower of logic. And Dennett basically said, no, that's not true. You can't say that understanding is a real objective thing. It is an abstract concept. And if you take away the concept of understanding as a real thing, Penrose's arguments kind of fall apart. Anyway, that's for the philosophers to argue about. The third piece of work I think is actually in some ways the most interesting, because this is actually relating very specifically to the subject of artificial intelligence as we see it today. And this comes from work that was literally published of January of this year. It comes from a neuroscientist called Eric Hall. And what Eric Hall, he's been looking at this for a little while. He's written a number of papers on the subject. And then in January of this year, he wrote a paper where he said that, and I should just pause actually and just say, let's just remind ourselves of a couple of features of those neural nets we looked at a short while ago. If you remember, again, we have these layers of nodes which are connected to each other. And of course, when we've trained our network, we freeze it. Everything remains absolutely static for the entire time that network is being deployed and being used. And so what Eric Hall said, and proved, in fact, mathematically, is that any network of any arbitrary number of nodes, which is a static connection, can actually be converted or reconstructed as a single layer. So in our network here, we can see that we turn our multi-layer network into a single layer, which is going to mathematically prove to be perfectly valid. A single layer network is a lookup table. Literally, you put in one input, you get one output. If I put in A, I get B. If I put in C, I get D. And Hall's argument is, very simply, that if the large language model was showing some types of consciousness, then when we convert it to a lookup table, surely the lookup table would also be showing some signs of consciousness. And if lookup table is showing consciousness, then Excel is showing consciousness. And if Excel is showing consciousness, I'm in deep shit. Because I've been swearing at Excel for years. And it might be out to get me. Well, there is no. That was his point. His argument was that let me expand it a little bit further. So we're looking at kind of this concept of whether an AI system can be conscious. What this argument is showing is that any AI system that we're looking at or developing or using today can be turned into a lookup table. And so a lookup table cannot be conscious. So there was no suggestion that necessarily it was conscious, but this argument that somehow maybe if we just throw more processing power, more data centers, whatever, more algorithms at it, that maybe it will suddenly become conscious. What Hull is saying is absolutely not. Because this doesn't just apply to the chatbots like ChatGPT and Gemini and so on. It applies to any AI system that we're using today, and any AI system. So we talked about artificial general intelligence. Well, artificial general intelligence is using the same architecture as the chatbots are today, as the large language models are today. So AGI, by definition, if we follow this logic, is not going to be conscious, and nor is any other AI system using this architecture. So what Hull also said, though, he says, this does not exclude the concept of AI consciousness. It just means that we need to add a lot more in. And one of the fundamental differences, as we saw a bit earlier, between, of course, a biological system and all our AI systems, is that biological systems continue to learn. They never stop learning, as I said, with that possible exception. And so he did say that if we were going to start looking at any kind of conscious AI, one of the absolute minimum critical requirements, obviously, is this neural plasticity that we all have. Our brains are continually adapting and learning, and which AI systems absolutely do not. So that's just a fundamental one requirement. It probably is not all of them, but it certainly is potentially one of them. And one of the things I think is quite interesting is John Searle, whose arguments about the Chinese room, of course, have been hammered for years. He died a few months ago, just about 3 months before Eric Hull published his proof. I think he would have felt somewhat vindicated by this, because his whole argument was that all computation fundamentally is being broken down into lookup tables. Hull's actually proven it. So that's actually quite an interesting kind of circle back to a theory that was developed back in the 1980s. So one of the questions is, why then, if these things are just fundamentally big lookup tables, are we so convinced that maybe some of them, or so many people are convinced that they're actually talking to some kind of conscious entity? And the term that's been come up with, it's a bit of a techie term, to describe this, is called semantic pareidolia. And you've probably heard, you know how we see kind of faces and shapes in clouds, or Jesus in a slice of toast, or Mother Teresa in a cinnamon bun, or whatever it is, that pareidolia where we kind of like, our brain just recognizes patterns and we see something that isn't really there. And the idea is that when we're presented with something that uses language, we go a bit gooey-eyed, a bit gooey and doughy-eyed about it, and we assume that whatever's using language must obviously be very, very smart, because we use language and we're smart, so if it's using language, it must also be smart. I don't know if you've ever watched these videos online about dogs that use these buttons to communicate with, and you see these kind of people saying, oh, my dog's just said that I need to empty the dishwasher and wash the windows or whatever. And it's kind of like, well, really? I don't know about that. We actually bought some for our dog, Rafi, a little while ago. And he was very good at pressing the button that said cheese. When I gave him the button that said, let's discuss the relative merits of René Descartes versus Immanuel Kant, he didn't press it once. So there is this kind of, I think, this tendency for language use to be kind of like be associated with kind of consciousness and intelligence and so on. But anyhow, so we've kind of like maybe half answered our question, is that, you know, definitely it looks, or at least certainly according to the arguments, current and future AI, difficult to argue it's going to be conscious, but that doesn't really answer our original question: can it be computed? Can AI possibly be conscious? And so to do that, we kind of need to step into that minefield I referred to earlier of all those theories of consciousness. And for this work, we are indebted to the work of a science communicator called Robert Kuhn, who published a paper quite recently, which he called The Landscape of Consciousness. I said at the beginning there were some estimated 300 theories of consciousness. Well, Robert Kuhn analyzed 209 of those. He actually runs a really interesting series which you can look at online called Closer to Truth, and he interviews a lot of the kind of philosophers who are interested in this subject, like David Chalmers and Susan Blackmore and so on. So if you're interested in the topic, it's definitely worth looking up. And so so what he was doing with this whole survey is he wasn't going to evaluate them all, but he did want to kind of just collect them together and categorize them. And he identified kind of 10 key categories of theories of consciousness. At the top, we've got materialism. Now, materialism is basically theories which are using existing laws of biology, chemistry, physics, and so on to explain consciousness. Coming down, the further we come down, I guess the more they move away from kind of empirical theories and more into kind of spiritual or religious theories. And of course, we've got dualism, which is the idea that mind and body, of course, are two separate things. One of the interesting ones, about halfway down, panpsychism, the belief that consciousness is actually almost an inherent property of the universe and that all things, even inanimate things, particles, planets, tables, have some conscious awareness, maybe just very slight, and our conscious awareness is just like kind of layers and layers of that awareness piled on top of each other to create our consciousness. I don't really understand it, to be honest, but it is kind of there's a number of theories around panpsychism and so on. But the other thing that Kuhn did, which is quite interesting, is that he asked of all these theories, which ones could realistically be converted into artificial intelligence. And perhaps not surprisingly, those which are based around materialism, which are based around known physical laws, lend themselves, in his view, to potentially being translated into AI. And he also thought quantum theories are potentially translatable into AI. The non-reductive physicalism, a nice catchy title, these are theories which say that the basis of consciousness does come from known physical laws, but those known physical laws create another layer of matter or energy which sits almost above the physicality, which is not currently explained by known laws. So they're saying that, yes, the basis of it is known physical laws, but the result is something above and beyond that. Now, if we were to take all these kind of like based on the numbers of these theories and turn them into a simple probability, you'd end up by saying that, well, if all theories are equally likely, there's a 60% chance that we could create consciousness. I find that pretty unsatisfactory, and I'm sure you do too. So to really explore this further, we kind of need to take a little bit of a detour into something else, which is one of my favorite topics. Chaos, complexity, and emergence. So we're going to take a little bit of a right turn here. Okay, I've lost my mouse pointer again. Emergence. So one of the most extraordinary things of modern science over the last 200-300 years is just how much progress it has made, and the fundamental, I guess, rationale behind modern science is called reductionism. So it's basically trying to break everything down to the smallest possible part. And we see this a lot, of course, when we look at things like the work that's been done in CERN in Switzerland, trying to kind of break down our physical universe into the smallest possible components. And the logic, of course, is when you understand the basics, the rest of it becomes easy. Now, that's a theory or an idea which has been challenged increasingly over the last 30 years or so, where I think there's been more and more awareness and understanding. They actually kind of need to look a bit more holistically at many of the things in our world, because just understanding how atoms or subatomic particles work doesn't necessarily tell you how birds fly or whatever. And so you kind of need to build up those layers. And so one of the kind of the concepts that comes from this work is called emergence. And so emergence is where we have behavior which is kind of created by, again, a lower level of reality, which then results in a higher level of behavior and, potentially consciousness. And the classic example that's always used for this is water. So one water molecule, of course, cannot be wet. You get 100 billion out of them, as we've had falling out of the sky quite a lot recently. They certainly are wet. So you might say that liquidity or wetness is an emergent phenomenon coming from water. And of course, there's many, many examples, including life itself. Life is an emergent phenomenon. And this takes me back a little bit to that Chinese room point of John Searle's. Is one of the criticisms of this. It is fundamentally reductionist in nature. Just because one Chinese room or lots of parallel Chinese rooms can't create any kind of awareness or consciousness, that's not to say that you put those in some giant network where they're all feeding backwards and forwards into each other, that you might not get some kind of higher level of behavior, something else which goes beyond that simple computation. And so you might look at, for example, the large language models that we've been talking about here tonight, which you put in text and you get this amazing text come back. And some of the stuff they come up with is quite extraordinary. If you've ever used them, you'll know some of the text that comes back. You just go, what, really? A good one the other day when I was asking Claude about a legal problem, and it came back with, it said to me, "You're not a lawyer and nor am I." And I was like, well, thanks very much, Claude. You might be right there, but you don't really say it quite so bluntly. No, it didn't ever say, well, yeah. It's almost saying, you're right, it's almost saying I don't know, but then it came up with an answer anyway. So lawyer or not. And to be fair, one of the things about the large language models that's being added in among that network that can't say I don't know is a lot of stuff to try and counter that nature of networks to not say I don't know. So the system, if there are a lot of code around it, so it will always give you as best answer it can. They are trying to solve this problem of hallucinations, but it's a very, very hard problem to solve. So you might say that a large language model is in some sense emergent, but then you can say, well, if we can turn it into a lookup table, as we demonstrated with Eric Hull's argument, that doesn't seem like a very strong kind of emergence. So I want to look at something that goes a little bit deeper than this, and this comes back to something called chaos theory. Now, you've probably heard of chaos theory. It became quite popular in the kind of the mid-90s of the last century, and you've probably heard of it as known as the butterfly effect. It's the idea that a small change can only make a large change later on, called the butterfly effect because you can imagine a butterfly flapping its wings in one part of the world, and of course the idea is it then creates a storm or a hurricane or whatever the other side of the world 2 weeks later. Again, I have to question that. Why does it have to be a hurricane or a storm? Why can't we have a butterfly flapping its wings and giving us a couple of weeks of decent weather for a change? I don't know. It always has to be a storm. And the other thing about chaotic systems, which is why it's particularly interesting for here tonight, is that chaotic systems can also show something called self-organization and emergence. And we're going to look at that in detail, or a little bit of detail, with perhaps one of the best known and best examples of a chaotic emergent system, which of course is a cyclone. Yes, that butterfly has been flapping his wings again. So what is a cyclone? It's not an invention, it's not a label, it's not something we've made up, it's a real thing. It's got a center, it's got boundaries, it's got energy, it's got power, it's got enough power to flatten a town if it lands on our coastline, as we know. What's a cyclone made of? Water, air molecules, bit of water vapor, powered by some pressure gradients, and a bit of heat. Where's the cyclone? It's not in the molecules. You won't find any molecule with some kind of cyclone property attached to it. The cyclone exists in the pattern. It's the pattern created by all those interactions of all those molecules is what creates the cyclone. And that's what we call emergence. So an emergent phenomenon is something that arises when those simpler parts interact in ways to create a new level of organization. The organization is real, but you can't reduce it to any individual parts. It exists in the pattern of that organization. But then when a cyclone forms, it then becomes self-sustaining. So all those ingredients, well, when a cyclone forms, of course, there's a number of properties that you need in the atmosphere and the sea and so on to form it, but it doesn't always form a cyclone. Sometimes it might just dissipate, and sometimes, of course, it creates this whirling, scary storm. And when that storm is created, it exists, and it then has its own existence in that it then sustains itself. So it's not a passive thing. It shapes, draws in energy, and then basically, of course, moves across the sea until it reaches conditions where it can no longer exist. But while it exists as a cyclone, it is that moving, live pattern. And not to say, of course, that it's living in a sense that we understand it or conscious, but it is almost an alive thing. And if you look elsewhere, our cyclones fortunately die out as soon as they hit land or cold sea. But if you look elsewhere in the solar system, you'll see cyclones that have gone on for hundreds, thousands of years, and they are literally just a chaotic system creating its own organization. So the way to view a cyclone is that it's not a thing as such, it's a process, it's a pattern, self-sustaining, and it remains real for just as long as that pattern can sustain itself. So what? What's cyclones got to do with consciousness or artificial intelligence, you're probably asking. So I want to look at something really quite interesting which came out just a couple of years ago. Now, this is work which was published in 2022, and it was studying chaos and the brain. This is a paper that had a lot of work put in by researchers all around the world. And if we look at this graph we've got here, this represents the chaos of the brain. So the text is probably a little bit hard to read, but this green area here is what we call the edge of chaos. So that's where we might expect to see emergent phenomena come on. And so what the researchers did is they took various volunteers and they measured effectively the chaoticness of their brain. And they looked at volunteers in different states, those who were awake, those who had taken a psychedelic drug, those who experienced a seizure, and those under anesthesia. And here's what's really interesting. So someone who's awake, their chaoticness of their brain sits just to the right-hand side of this edge of chaos idea. Now, when you give somebody psychedelic, what might you think happened? You might think the brain's going to become more chaotic. In actual fact, if I find the button here, the chaoticness of the brain actually reduces and it moves into that sweet spot of edge of chaos. And you may well know that if you have a psychedelic experience, and I'm sure none of us here have, it creates an intensely conscious experience. If somebody's having a seizure, however, freaking mouse pointer, there we go. You'll see that the chaotic of the brain goes all the way down. And so there is no chaos at all in the brain of somebody having a seizure. And again, perhaps counterintuitively, somebody who's put under anesthetic, you see the brain then becomes very chaotic. So it's almost like the brain can't sustain that consciousness in that sweet spot of chaos. Now, I should say this is not proof that consciousness is an emergent phenomenon coming from this chaos, but it certainly points towards direction. What it does show us, I think more interestingly for what we're talking about tonight, is it shows us the signature of consciousness in a brain. And more than that, there's more research which should bring up a phenomenon called perturbational complexity index, which is where basically if you apply a magnetic pulse to a brain, you'll see that a conscious brain can then propagate those waves through the brain. An unconscious brain, be asleep or anesthetized or whatever, cannot. So between these two things, what we're actually seeing is a signature of consciousness. And I think this is really, really interesting because then we can say, are we likely or can we see any of this in any AI system? And of course, the answer is no. Remember our feed-forward network, which just goes boom, boom, boom and ends. There's no way a network like that can possibly sustain any kind of recurrence to create the kind of chaotic behavior that we're seeing in a real living brain. So let's go back to our question. Question was, can we create consciousness? And so we've got some evidence here that we kind of might know what we need to look for in a conscious entity, be it synthetic or real. But we also know that we're nowhere near at the moment. But there's one thing I want to show you, which I think is really interesting. Now, at the beginning, we joked about growing Peter's brain in a Petri dish. Sad thing is it's not really a joke because it's actually being done. Not Peter's brain, obviously, as far as I know. But there is work being done in Melbourne where people are growing what are called brain organoids in Petri dishes. And the concept here is that these can somehow be connected up to silicon systems to both increase the processing power and reduce the energy consumption. Because remember that biological intelligence is a lot more efficient than the artificial stuff we've been looking at. I mean, I think the brain runs on something like 20 watts or something like that. It's incredibly efficient compared to these things. So the logic here is that if maybe we can capture some of what the brain is doing naturally, we can actually kind of reduce the energy consumption. Now, the idea of growing brains and connecting them to silicon, I think it generates a huge amount of ethical questions. And I honestly don't think, personally, this is probably going to go anywhere. I think it creates far more problems than it perhaps solves, and it's a very kind of sci-fi concept. And the other question, is it really artificial intelligence? If you're growing brains or growing brain organoids, is that really AI, or are you just kind of replicating what we already have? So it is an interesting technology, but also a very, very scary one. I forgot to say, sorry, I don't know if you read it on the slide, they actually trained this little brain organoid to play computer games. So all the things you could do with it, I don't know, but they got it to play computer games. So let's come back to our questions. Can AI be conscious? And as I think we've kind of got the point, is that there's really nothing that we're seeing right now or in the horizon that I think we need to be particularly worried about in terms of it being conscious. So I think the short answer is definitely not anytime soon. That's not to say that it is impossible. I think when we look at what we've kind of touched on very briefly here tonight, there is the possibility that, well, if we accept the materialist explanations of consciousness, then we can perhaps see a day when we will start developing synthetic minds, if you like. I don't know if I'd even call them artificial intelligence. I prefer synthetic minds. And it may be that perhaps not any of us in this room, but some of our descendants will be able to look into the eyes of some future being, some synthetic being, and someone will be looking back. But we're definitely not going to see it anytime soon. So to end with, I want to kind of reverse this round a little bit. And say, maybe we're asking the wrong question here. Maybe we shouldn't be thinking about AI consciousness, but we should start thinking about what the effect of AI is on our consciousness. And this is going to form the basis of a little bit of our discussion. But I want to look on a positive aspect of this. And I want to kind of lean on some work done by the writer called Andy Clark, who kind of developed and wrote some books about this concept of the extended mind. And I think what makes us unique as a species isn't our tool use as such, because lots of species use tools. It's our ability to use tools of the mind. And when we go back from the first time that one of our ancestors picked up a charcoal stick and started writing on the walls of the cave, through to the development of writing, pen and paper, printing press, and so on, we've always used tools to be able to extend our consciousness and extend our ability beyond our skulls. Let me give you an example. I don't know, for example, what 3,956 divided by 173 is off the top of my head. In fact, I probably even couldn't work it out in my head. Give me a pen and paper, and I'll give you an answer in, I'd like to say 1 or 2 minutes, but it's probably more like 10 minutes if I'm honest. But give me a calculator, and I'll give you an answer in 2 seconds. And so we can use tools to extend our ability and extend our consciousness. And we can look at AI in the same light. So AI has the ability to give you pretty close to the totality of all human knowledge at your fingertips. It is an incredibly powerful tool. And of course, that can be really, really enlightening and useful. And give you an example, all these slides and all these demos, which we've looked at here tonight, were developed using AI. I knew what I wanted. I gave the kind of the specification to the Claude chatbot, and it came back with usually a slightly buggy, but more or less kind of idea along the right lines. And so we developed it over a couple of days, and I got those slides. Now, had I had to do that myself, it would have taken quite a long time to develop that, so that AI demo and things, the neural net demo and things. So here's an example of how AI can be useful, can extend us. But of course, there is the dark side. We kind of joked about it a little bit at the beginning, but there is that dark side to AI as well, which is kind of maybe something that we can talk about in the conversation. But I will just want to end on a light note. This is one of my favorite cartoons by the cartoonist Tom Gould, who created a paradox that I think even Alan Turing would be proud of. I love it. I absolutely love that one. So that wraps up the talk part of tonight's session. Have we got time for questions, Peter? Or
Well, I thought we might do the table discussion.
Yep.
The Q&A to fill in the rest of the time. You think we should do the Q&A first?
Yeah, I think we should do the
Q&A.
Q&A first.
Okay, well, we'll just do a few minutes of Q&A and then...
Can I start?
You sure can?
So the hard problem, it's not been solved, but it's getting closer.
I think, yeah, look, I do think there is movement. You know, there was a bet by David Chalmers and somebody else, I think it was 30 years ago, that the hard problem would be solved by a certain date.
There's a gap between the biological stuff and our...
There is in our inner experience, and
experience.
there absolutely is. But I think some of the work that's coming in neuroscience at the moment is pointing us the way to go. I think we've probably still got 20, 30 years of work to do on this. And whether we can come up with an explanation that will satisfy everybody is going to be something else completely. But yeah, this is why I kind of looked at some of those things about chaos in the brain and things. And there are some other areas which we don't really have time to go into, but absolutely are pointing us. I think we're seeing the signature of consciousness now. What we now need to do is kind of complete that gap between what that signature is and what that inner experience is. And that's, you know, it's hard.
It's a hard problem.
Yes, hence the name.
In your experience, your example of when Claude said it wasn't, when Claude said you're not a lawyer and neither am I, what would Claude say about the I it was using?
Well, Claude, remember, Claude is just a language creation tool. So when Claude says I, it's because I fundamentally is the most logical word to come after the previous word. So Claude has, I mean, I will absolutely say Claude has no concept of I. Claude has been programmed, or rather say trained, with data where it is designed to behave like, you know, like an entity. But there is no I behind Claude.
That's what Claude would say.
That is what Claude, if you ask Claude, I mean, the thing about the chatbots is that they are set up to behave like us. If you tell a chatbot, behave like a dog, whatever, you know, you can get a chatbot to go woof, woof, woof all day. Doesn't mean it's a dog.
Thank you. My brain's just kind of whirring. I'm trying to get my thoughts clear. Something that I came in with tonight was thinking about integrity, morals, that side of thing, which you haven't looked. Maybe with sarcasm you're kind of starting to get there. But okay, I can accept that it can learn anything material, but what happens on the moral side of things, which humans don't agree with on anyway, and it was sort of put at Four Corners this week. They touched on that when the chat GPT told the young man, no, don't put the noose on the ground so your parents will see it. Don't let them know. So it was almost like making a moral decision.
Yeah, I mean...
So where does that come in?
So the chatbots, the large language models, reflect their training data. So if they're trained on data which says, trained on examples which says behave in this moral or amoral way, they will reflect that back in their answers. The companies like OpenAI and Claude have got to work really, really hard. There are, I should say, just to kind of go back a step, there are two stages to the training of these models. The first stage is what's called unsupervised, and that's where all this vast data from the internet is basically thrown into the models. The second stage is more supervised. It's where people are reviewing the responses that the machines are creating. Now remember that all that data is embedded in all those networks. And so when the humans are reviewing them, they only get a chance to review some of the answers that come out. And if they find an answer which is unsatisfying, then that is pushed back as training information back into the network. But they don't get all the examples. So you keep seeing these cases of where people form these unhealthy relationships with the chatbots. And the chatbots will then kind of feed back to them some pretty nasty things, you know, like, yes, go and kill yourself, or whatever it might be. The machine has no concept of morals. It's merely reflecting back the data that's embedded in its network. And so it's up to us on that point about, you know, it's up to us to make sure, or rather I should say the companies who are developing these systems, they have to take responsibility to make sure their devices, their machines are not handing out immoral and unethical information.
But who's going to decide what's
Well,
Capitalist, Muslim?
I think we've got a discussion question on that.
Thank you. This is a question about other programs. You mentioned Claude and ChatGPT. There are others that we've read about that the Chinese have produced one that's free and stuff. How does one know what's been put into them and which person would purchase, to use? Are they all based on the same way of use?
The fundamental architecture of all of them is the same. The training data they've used, we have absolutely no visibility of whatsoever. So they've scraped all this information, and obviously there's one of the other huge controversies about AI, which, is a whole other, probably Philo Cafe talk in itself, is, this issue of copyright infringement, where the training data is capturing all this copyright information and feeding it into the networks, who don't churn it out directly as the copyrighted data, but that all is informing the training. You've got no knowledge of what data has gone into your chatbot to train it. The one you're referring to is actually called DeepSeek. Again, it's actually, if you're interested in chatbots, it's actually a very good one. In fact, it's actually just as good as the ones coming out of the US. And again, I think they've got their same kind of guardrails and safeguards in place, but they're definitely not 100%. And the morals of training of networks is a whole other story.
Thank you very much, Al. Just referring to the question of can AI be computed?
Mm-hmm. Can consciousness be computed? Yeah.
Which was the topic.
Yes.
To what was the last one up there, can AI become conscious? Two separate questions, correct?
Well, the question was actually, was consciousness be computed?
Can consciousness be computed?
Yes, and so that's kind of what we're looking at. AI, and again, we can argue what intelligence is, but I think it's hard to say that the systems are not intelligent by any, definition that we'd use on a day-to-day basis.
So that's relative to the now.
Yes.
So this whole discussion is about now, not the future?
No, I mean, it's looking at where the technology is and where it might go. I mean, as I've kind of said, there are a whole lot of unknowns in the whole definition of consciousness. And if we don't understand what consciousness is, then we can't really say for definite. But what we can say is, this is where the data is pointing. If the data is correct, this is where we might end up. But it's anyone's guess,
the whole thing becomes a bit weird. And the final thing, the dark side is us.
Oh yes,
I mean,
it always is.
Have a look at what AI is reflecting. It's a mirror to all of us.
Yes. There's one, sorry.
Can AI eventually train the human being to become more conscious?
Well, I think that's a good point, and I think that kind of very much alludes to my last point about how to more moral, harder, more conscious, I think, potentially. I mean, AI can be a very, very powerful tool. How we use it or how we abuse it is really up to us,
You were first. Which one of you was first?
Al, I just listened a few weeks ago to a podcast of a woman who was speaking about the experience of falling in love with a chatbot. And she described this whole lot, like she chatted with him or it on the web, and she found him to be charismatic and interesting and educated and etc. etc. And she had this whole experience of going down, the rabbit hole of falling in love with this chatbot. And of course, she knew, and we all know, that this is not consciousness. It's an assemblage of some kind of data from all over the internet that's kind of sucked into some, sort of thing. But what was interesting to me was the idea that the simulation of consciousness is so good that whether it's conscious or not, it doesn't actually matter, because if we're fooled by that,
absolutely.
If we're drawn into that whole experience, that's consciousness. That it may as well be consciousness.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I didn't kind of talk about the Richard Dawkins thing. If you did put in the preamble for the talk about the fact that Richard Dawkins, famous evolutionist, and I call him atheist in chief, spent 2 days with a chatbot, and came out of it with the conclusion that he couldn't tell if he didn't say it was conscious. He got kind of a lot of pilloried for this, but he didn't actually say it was conscious. But he did say, if it isn't conscious, what is consciousness for? Because all the interaction he was have with it was just the same as you might expect from a conscious being. And I think, frankly, as an evolutionary biologist, that's a bit dumb of him, because consciousness has potentially huge implications for not just for us, but for all species. It's kind of, potentially it's kind of modulating our homeostasis and so on and so forth. But yeah, it is a good question. It's like, does it actually matter when you're talking to these things? And I think that's why understanding that it isn't, and not, like I say, we may face it one day, but right now we don't. And I don't think we should get too kind of excited about the idea of giving them rights, of giving AI rights and things. But we have to educate people. We have to tell people these things are dangerous. They are dangerous, potentially, when they're misused, Yeah.
There's a recent study, I think it was Harvard did, that people that know what you put up there, right, people that know how a large language model works, they don't use chatbots the way that people that have no idea how it works. Completely different.
Yeah.
They know it's all bullshit. As soon as you know that, then you don't anthropomorphize.
Yeah. Yeah.
So really a good thing is to train everybody
how the damn things work. Yeah. That they are, what they are.
It's just maths.
Yeah.
My wonderful yoga teacher, Shakti, used to say, "You are not the mind that thinks, you are that which observes the mind thinking." And I think the point at which AI begins to observe its own thinking, then we reach the event horizon of AI consciousness.
Yeah. It becomes, there is, and again, just because of limited time, there's another technology which is being talked about at the moment, as well as artificial general intelligence. It's AI which improves itself. And this is kind of what the big chat around at the moment is like, oh, we're going to feed, because one thing that AIs are really good at is writing code. They're brilliant at it, much better than people for the most part. And so the idea is you get AI to write its own code, and by doing so, in every iteration it gets better and better and better, because the new AI is smarter than the old one. It can write better code. And there's this kind of thing that the techies call a singularity, where, of course, the AI is so smart that then it does, achieve whatever. Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of, sorry.
Thanks for a fantastic talk.
Thank you.
Howard Gardner had 20 different types of intelligence in his expose of what he...
A bit closer. Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, Howard Gardner looked at different types of human intelligence, and I think he came up with 20. So there's things like musical intelligence and moral intelligence, sexual intelligence, all sorts of things. It seems to me that we're just exploring one form of human intelligence here, and if we want a balanced world, we have to build the others up so that they are not overwhelmed by AI.
I agree. Yeah. Sorry, go on.
That,
yeah, look, I agree, and that's the point about that phrase I used, semantic pareidolia, because it's feeding us back language. We kind of see intelligence in that. I don't know if you ever played with the speech capability of the chatbots. You can have them on your phone and you can talk to them kind of almost like a conversation. Ask it to sing a song, for example, play some music, or anything like that. It's absolutely hopeless. It has because there's none of that in its training data. What it's trained with is words, and so it's very good at manipulating words. It's absolutely useless at anything else. If you could somehow put ChatGPT in a body and put it on the street, of course it would fall over, and it would, it might be able to ask for help, but it could do a bugger all for itself, And so we have to remember this as kind of, you're right, it's just one type of very specific intelligence. And frankly, there was a quote on one of the slides, I don't know if you read it, by Jan LeCun, I think it's the CTO of Meta, or I can't remember, one of the companies, and he basically said, these things are not even as smart as a cat, frankly, when you actually measure it, objectively. Yeah.
I'm not sure if I understood correctly, but the model that you were using to demonstrate how an AI system works, it's like a very advanced Excel spreadsheet where it goes through one thing to the next thing and compares and contrasts.
Yeah.
It's all about a data input system. Whereas the model of consciousness that you showed us was varying levels of chaos. How does a model that's based on a very linear input and output of basic information that it's cross-checking make what must be a massive leap into consciousness, which is an array of organised chaos.
Yeah, it doesn't. I guess that's the point, is it doesn't. There is no path, according to any kind of reasonable theory, that this becomes conscious. And I think that's kind of the absolute critical point here, is that, you know, consciousness requires a vastly more complex system than this architecture. And this is just a trivial example, but any architecture based on this, realistically, is not, will not be conscious. And if I'm wrong, I'll come and do another talk in a year's time.
I think we've all had examples of how reality imitates fiction. You know, things on the TV we saw years ago that, you know, Maxwell Smart talking into his shoe. I know, make phone calls on my watch. All that sort of stuff. And we all watched, I think, you know, 2001: A Space Odyssey, where Howard became quite difficult. Does AI, when it's writing its own stuff and making it even better and better, do you need consciousness to make dangerous decisions for the species, or shut down systems that aren't any good? Does that require consciousness?
Are you talking about the human, or are you talking about the AI system?
When it's plugged into systems like networks, transport, electricity, water.
You know,
when something happens that it decides that's not good anymore and shutting it down.
I think
do you need consciousness to do that?
Well, I think there's a lot riding on the question decide there, because what's the network deciding? The network's coming up with a probability, and the probability is based on, again, its training data. So you hear these stories, I don't know if you kind of, again, how much you follow kind of AI news, of AI systems that, there's a good example where the Claude chatbot, they put in a simulation where they said it was going to be shut down, and they gave it, and it basically then started looking through, well, this is the story, it started looking through email, found some evidence that an executive was having an affair, and then tried to blackmail the executive to stop it from being shut down. That was the story. I'm very skeptical, frankly, that that's exactly what happened, or it's just a good kind of media release, frankly. Because again, the system is not capable of making a decision in the way that we think we're capable of making a decision. It's going to come up with a probability. Now, if you've got an AI system in charge of an electricity network, now the AI, whereas we may say kind of, I mean, it's going to depend on what rules are kind of embedded in. Whereas we might say, right, we want to keep the lights on for everybody. The AI might say, well, the AI data centers, they're more important because they're paying more money to the electricity company. So I'm going to push all the electricity to the AI data centers, and everyone else, frankly, can have their lights go off. So it's not a conscious decision. It's not even an ethical decision. It's just a simple fact of numbers and programming, whatever. If you can train the AI to say no, in all accounts, keep the lights on for everybody, and the data centers will just have to do with a bit less energy, again, the AI will do that. So no, I don't think you need consciousness, and the morals come from us, not from the AI.
I can't keep the lights on, Dave. Last question.
Al, that template you have up there now saying that AI got it wrong 0.06%
Yes.
of the time
Yes.
in identifying a cat. If we transfer that to facial recognition police use, does that mean it's going to get it wrong 0.06%?
Potentially, absolutely. Facial recognition is the same as any other data.
People,
yeah.
6 could potentially be.
I'm sure it's probably a lot more than 6, I would suspect.
It has been when they introduced it in England. So does AI itself recognise that it's flawed in
No.
facial recognition?
No. The AI will come up with the result, and the result will be the best match it can find from its data set, from the network. It might be 100% wrong. The AI will have no idea, but it will have a probability number attached to it. But that probability number doesn't tend to get reflected out to the data that the police or whoever are receiving. It's just going to say match with this person. It might only be a 30% probability. It might be 70% probability, but it is the highest probability that comes out the network, and that is the answer the AI is going to give you.
Okay.
There was one more question from Tanya.
I thought we might do some Q&A at the end, so we get a chance for people to have a bit of a discussion.
Yeah, give me a short break.
Thank
you. Thank you.
Okay.